missiological lens was sharpened, honed, and framed by my time in South Africa. And so as we take a look at first facing the growth barriers, I want to give you some context for my view of this. First of all, I do not believe that anybody can fix a church. I don't believe in fixing churches. I believe in strengthening churches. And that means in the New Testament that Paul would go or send his team members to churches and take whatever was there and make it stronger. That's this move. That's all we are, is people that can maybe assist and aid one another at taking what's there and making it stronger. I also believe that we survey churches as humans, and we can help, even as a senior pastor, look at your own church and survey it and tend to figure out what it is. But God shakes churches. Jesus shakes them. We survey them. God figures out how to get us fundamentally to the very roots of the things that we're building that will not be shaken because they're built on the kingdom. And anytime we build anything extraordinary that can be shaken, he is faithful to come and shake those things down to their essence. So we are not sovereigns. We are not saviors. We're servants. And so I want to say that very loudly from the very beginning, that Christ is the head of the church. He's been doing a great job of that in the past. He's doing a great job presently, and he will do a fantastic job in the future. I do not have a negative view to the church, even in declining America. I don't, because Jesus is leading it and he's up to something, and it's his job. I can't help 400,000 churches. Jesus is on the scene. So all of that's important for you to hear from me, because everything I say and do is based on human level engagement, and I let Jesus do his job, that he is doing extremely well. So I'm not negative about anything in the church, even dying churches, even churches that are being unearthed as now heretical. The parable of the weeds describes that. So that's always been in play. So with that kind of as the backdrop, Christ is the head of the church. I want to take a look and think through barriers and identifying what those barriers are. And so I'd like you, if you have a pen, I on purpose didn't include some slides, because when you pick up a pen and you start writing, your brain flips and it lights up both sides of the brain, and it creates a mnemonic, and you can remember a little better. I have a lens that includes 6 things that I think are barriers to churches all over the world. This is not a Western model. I developed it myself, not to teach people, but so that I could help. So this is my missiological lens. My lens on barriers include these 6 things. Number 1, spiritual. There are spiritual barriers when we are facing planting churches. Now, I don't think churches being planted and growing is hard. I think it's impossible. It's far worse than hard. It's impossible to plant a church and to grow a church. And the reason is because unless Jesus shows up, everything that we do will fail. Unless we preach the gospel, every word we say will fall on deaf ears. And so we deeply rely on the Spirit of God. There are opposing forces called Satan and demons. And so I think there's a spiritual barrier. Second, personal. I think there's all kinds of things that are inside of us as persons that can cause and hinder or help churches to grow. So personal is a category for me. Relational, your ability to engage other people, your IQ, if you want to say it that, your IQ and your capacity to do that, to engage the mission of Christ. And what I believe is kind of the love of Christ? Are you the kind of person that is compelled by love relationally? Next is organizational, and we'll talk a lot about that maybe in the next session. But there are organizational reasons that churches will not grow and can't grow or grow greatly. You heard, I think Saviwe was alluding to the creation account in Saviwe's Old Testament course in seminary, where organization is used as a construct that Moses unpacked how God engaged something that was formless and void, non-functional, and turned it into functional, and then very functional, and it was super functional. And so that idea, when he put man in the garden and he gave him the task of taking the things that were in the garden and making them more fruitful. So organization, we'll talk a lot about that, is really the science of taking what's there and making it more and more fruitful. We'll talk about how the difference between a good organization and a bad organizational thing. Missional, that is the gathered and scattered constructs of a church. It's both hermeneutic and homiletic, your ability to rightly divide the word of truth and then look at your culture and your context and create a hermeneutic towards it. Those are deeply serious barriers throughout all of church history. If you study church history, you know those are there. There's a harvest now versus a harvest later mentality in the missional construct. Jesus confronted his disciples because they had a harvest later view, and they were just looking at the woman from Samaria. And he said, I know that you can't even see. I see the fields are white unto harvest, and you think there's all kinds of issues. So in a missional construct, that's critical. And there's an expansional bend to that. And finally, a contextual. You won't find a lot of this in the growth barriers kind of literature. Most of them are Western. Most of them emanate from the US, most of them. But there's contextual barriers. Your city, your locale, your ethnic makeup, poverty or wealth, war, peace, persecution, and freedom. There's lots of things stuck up in there that can create real obstacles to the gospel spreading. And so I'll say those again: spiritual, personal, relational, organizational, missional, and then contextual. Those are the makeup of what I see. If you develop that kind of a lens, you'll be able at least to diagnose well when you're looking and trying to find the growth barriers. It's critical to diagnose well before you begin to go into the what is it that's going to fix this. And so I want to take a look at the first slide to give some context to growth barriers, and then we're going to pause in a few minutes, and we're pause in a few minutes, and then we'll do question and answer. So Q&A is going to be really important for me, because I don't want to talk about things you guys, and I want to say this, forgot to say this, I know I'm online with all experts. You are expert, I'm an expert, we're all experts. So this is not the expert talking to a bunch of small experts. You are experts. So your insight and your questions are going to be critical. Most churches seem to face some kind of a growth barrier at different key points. Now, I want to say, here's a common grid that you see. And so this is pretty broadly accepted. Most of the churches that things we'll be talking about would be applicable to churches probably 300 and below. But the bigger principles will apply all the way up to the thousands. But this is insightful. I want you to go to the next slide, the church plant facts slide. 90% of the churches in the world are less than 200. My guess is that 95% now are less than 200 in the entire world. I would say throughout all of church history, that would hold true, if not higher, and maybe the 98, 99. If you look at Western and Central Europe, 99.7 to 8% of all those churches are under 200. And so the 200 barrier is always called the impenetrable barrier. And there's a lot of reasons why. We'll get into those later. 50% of the churches in America are less than 100. 61.2% of the churches in the Philippines are less than 50. Less than 50. 70, and this was 2009 statistics. 75.6% of churches in the Philippines are less than 75. Only 1.2% of the churches in the Philippines are between 3 to 500. Only 0.3% of the churches in the Philippines are more than 1,000 and up. To give you some kind of a context for scale, I know that you don't think like you've been doing a good job unless you're a mega church, which is absolutely astronomically wrong. The leadership group published research that they did, and there's between 28 million and 30 million churches in the world today. I think that's probably close. Of those 28 to 30 million churches that run above 2,700 on Sunday, they say there's less than 3,000 of them. And they also say that 1,700 of those are housed in North America. Let's say they were terrible in their research and it's twice as many churches. That would be only 6,000 churches out of 30 million churches in the world today. So we can make some assumptions from there. A, God rarely in all of church history decides, because it's God that decides to start a church and sizes a church and all that. We'll talk about that in a minute. God decides to do something super extraordinary in a locale, and he hardwires a very unique kind of a leader and puts around them very unique kinds of leaders, and something scale happens. And it's always because of God's plan and idea. It's always a sovereign move, and you can't do that without that. I know a lot of people that are trying to build mega churches, and they haven't broke 200, and they've been working it decades. So it's not a try, it's a God thing. I'm convinced, absolutely convinced of that. I recently heard Tim Keller in an interview where he was asked about mega churches, and he said, you know, if I had it to do all over again, I hated leading a mega church because it's just so hard. It takes so much effort. But he said this, he said, but I know that before we started our church in Manhattan, 3% of the population or less was Christian. When he retired, 30% of Manhattan was Christian. And he said, my guess is this, that the small churches in Manhattan couldn't have done what we did. And so God chose to make us big. I agree with that. And so hopefully this will make everyone relax and take a deep breath, and we can begin to kind of unpack some of these ideas about churches. So this is the truth. If you have a church in Poland that ran 300, you would have the largest church in the entire nation. And the exceptions to those rules in Europe seem to be just ethnic churches, a Nigerian church, some kind of an expat church. But if you did that if you had a church of 300 anywhere in all of Europe, that is a massively significant church. Okay, I want to look at the next slide. Take a look at the next slide about evangelical churches in the Philippines, just to highlight some of this. So you'll see that the majority of churches are below 50, 38% as far as a category. Then you've got all the way up to 1,000 plus. So that'll give you some kind of a grid there to take a look at. Next slide. The wrong question is, how do I get my church to grow? Not your job to force growth. 1 Corinthians 3:6, I said, I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God made it grow. Church growth is about God's power and his choice to work through us. Refuse to settle for anything less, I want to reiterate this by saying it this way. Christ is the head of the church. He's working behind us. He goes before us. He works in us. He works through us. He works in spite of us, and he works because of us. To God be the glory. How many of you know God works behind us, cleaning up the messes that we make as leaders? He works in us and through us and around us and all over. And so all the glory for anything that grows is Jesus Christ. It's to him and to him alone. And so the right question to ask, the next slide, is what is keeping my church from growing? And that will be our next session. So I want to just focus on these 5 things, spiritual, and I'll go back over them now and give more detail. So I think because of the things I've just talked about, when you have a barrier for growth, and go back to the Philippine slide that shows the churches of 30, churches of 50, go back to that slide. Let's focus on this slide, and I want to talk about some growth barriers. First of all, there are spiritual barriers. There's spiritual barriers in the end of the staff or the pastor's soul, in the church itself. We know that Corinth had a sin in the church, and it was the sin of lovelessness. Well, that created a growth barrier. I mean, you know, if you don't love out of Christ's love, you will not be compelled. The love of Christ is the most compelling, sacrificial force in human existence. Nothing compels stronger than the love of Christ. Well, they were loveless. So therefore, all the things that you read about the chaos in that church were because of a core sin. So sin is spiritual, last time I checked. And so that can be a growth barrier. Many churches just need to repent. They don't need to restructure. They don't need to re-strategize. They need to repent first. And so there's spiritual things. We know that that the church at Galatia left the gospel. I think that's kind of spiritual. And so that was a spiritual thing. We know other things existed in the church that created these barriers. And so there are spiritual reasons, theological, heresy, all kinds of things under the spiritual category of Satan and demons coming against the churches. And so the spiritual vitality of a church, just all these things that would fit in the category of spiritual. Then there's personal. We talked about emotional, philosophical, seasons of life. I've known churches that have just had 2 extremely difficult. Friend of mine, the church he pastors is a mega church, close friend of mine, and it's one of the best churches in America. There have been suicides, a murder in his church, death of his closest friend, and all of that within the context of a few months. And he's in a tough season, or was in a tough season. He's out of it now. And so there's a lot of personal reasons. I know with me, my family was falling apart. My marriage was not falling apart, but in just a stalemate. My church we had 50 or 60 people move from the city that gutted. This was right after our church plant. So that was a significant group of people. They all left the city for different reasons, primarily job related. And my dad was almost dying, and he was in my home, and they said he was going to die. It was a terrible time. And I was in a serious season of life. It's interesting, in that season of my life, our church grew faster and they had less of me. So unless you think this is a easy cookie cutter thing, figure that one out. They got less of me and the church grew more. So therefore, if it's cookie cutter, the advice I would have, all of you disengage your church and watch it grow. For those of you that didn't understand, that was sarcasm. That was a joke. Personal, relational. I know people that can grow a church to 150, and then because they're relationally, they have a very low relational IQ. They don't connect very well with people. Their churches collapse back into the 50 to 60 category because of that. Your relational IQ matters. Organizational. What is your capacity to change? Can you change well? Do you do change? What is your philosophy like? Your structure, your systems, your personnel, your strategies, your ability to execute, evaluate, your evaluative skills, your adjusting skills, the whole Acts 6 thing, where the apostles had to reorganize completely the way that they led. They weren't creating a diaconate. They were saying, we can't lead like this anymore. This is ridiculous. We can't lead like this. So we have to change. At some point, you have to change. And we'll talk about that, breaking the 200 barrier. Then missional. I already went through that, the gathered, scattered, the hermeneutic, homiletic, and then contextual, I went through that. So I want to focus on those 5 things, or 6 things, and I want to open up for questions. What are these barriers that we're facing? Of those 6, do you have questions? Do you also have insight about these? I want to pause and let you guys weigh in, ask questions.
Pastor Kevin, I have a question for you. My name is Moritz Zitzman. I'm from Every Nation 20. I just quickly want to know, the 200 barrier that we are talking about, does that include kids and youth, or is it apart from?
Almost all barriers include children. The reason is because it's harder to lead a larger group than a smaller group. So if you always exit your children, you're not really, that burns a lot of energy. You have to spend a lot of energy on kids. And so I never like statistics that don't include children. Children tell me an awful lot. They tell me a ton about a church. If the children's department is empty or full, I work with a church, was working with a church recently that runs about 1,800, and they had less than 200 children in the nursery. So I knew immediately it was an older church. I knew that immediately that probably they had hermeneutic issues. They weren't connecting to their culture very well. And that was true after we did a lot of deep work on it. So yes, that includes children, because if you have, yes, it does include children. Great question, by the way. Spiritual, personal relation. Go ahead, somebody.
It's Philip here.
Hey, Philip.
Just on that question, would you say that the barriers that we talk about for a church barrier in a micro way is also going to kind of be the same, relational, spiritual, for the kids, for the youth, for the campus? It's kind of the same principles that are playing downward in all those different sectors.
Philip, that's a great observation. Yes. The problem I had when I was formally trained, the problem I had when I left the soil of the US was somehow coming up with a grid and a way to view that I could actually be helpful. And that means I think this grid works in a macro setting and a micro setting. And so, Philip, that's a great observation. Yes, if I was diagnosing a children's department, I would do the same. Obviously, and it would be different, gathered and scattered. But I think if you're dealing with children, there ought to be some kind of sentness to those children. They need to leave church, especially your high school department and your junior high, with some sense of mission to engage. So yes, I do. I use that grid. It's subconscious with me now. It's how I evaluate, and I'm thinking all the time.
Hi, Pastor Kevin. It's Christo here.
Hey, Christo.
Fine, and you? So how do I know when I've hit a growth barrier? What is the indicators I must look for to know that this is a barrier I'm hitting? And what should I do if I realize this is a barrier that I can't break on my own? What should I do?
I think there's 2 things I think that can be some indication: plateau or yo-yo. Plateau is you just flatten out. Obviously, yo-yo is you do this. You're going up and down and up and down and up and down. You're reaching lost people, but you can't. They seem to not be sticking. Your perhaps your discipleship track, your 4 E's, whatever thing that you use, it doesn't seem to be working. And so I think it's at those times that you should that you know that you're in some kind of a growth barrier. And so it's plateau and yo-yo. Those are the things that you all know what a yo-yo is, that goes up and down. I guess that's a global thing. But that's the indication.
And what should I do if I realize that I'm actually in a growth barrier? What's the couple of things? Yeah.
That's the next session. So we'll talk about all that in the next session.
Pastor Kevin, I have a question for you. It's Carol here.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm just wondering about your personal barriers, and the examples you gave seem to indicate that it was largely the senior pastor's personal barriers, I guess, that were influencing the church. Is that a correct assessment, or are personal barriers broader than that?
Very correct. I've never seen any research that indicates anything other than that. And even in the early church, churches that seem to impact in the very earliest of times to have, the whole Apollos and some say you're of Apollos. Those were gifted men and women. And so in the early days, as buildings and dining rooms begin to be remodeled because of the effectiveness of certain churches, it was primarily because of a single dynamic leader in those areas, and that's throughout all of church history. And so, yes, most of my focus, in fact, I tell all senior pastors before I consult with them, what I'm going to find is you. I'll do all this research, and at the end of it will be you, your strengths, your weaknesses, your gaps. And that's now, if I went in to a denominational church in America that was driven by the deacons, I would use a totally different grid, but it still works there. Here in the US, the average life of a pastor, I think in the Southern Baptist, 50,000 churches, about a year and a half. Now, why that is because if you graduate from a seminary and you're a superstar guy, they'll send you to a larger small city to the First Baptist Church, and that's your foot in, and that's a career path thing. And so they come into those scenarios where they have very little power, and all of a sudden the church explodes. Well, now you've just told the Southern Baptist Church that now you're worthy of a larger city and a larger church, and they take you out immediately. And so even in those kinds of leadership scenarios, we find the necessity of that leader, even if they're not truly empowered. When they come in, they know that. Is that helpful, Carol?
Yes, really great. It's helpful and scary at the same time.
Oh, it's very scary. That's why James said not many of you should be teachers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kevin. This is Ronald here from Uganda.
Ronald, good to hear your voice.
Thank you, Dr. Kevin. I also wanted to ask, one question would be, is there something like a natural barriers, for example, experienced COVID or floods or earthquake? Would you call that a natural barrier? But also another question would be, is there a tool or something we could use to measure these barriers, or it's just about natural observation? How would someone literally understand those barriers to evaluate your church?
Ronald, we're going to talk about some of that in the next session. But I will say this, there's a long held, and Ronald, make sure at the end, I want to make sure I answered your question. There's a long held ancient, I don't even know where it began or was started, a view of churches from 0 to 200 that said there were 3 main things. And this obviously is also a view behind to church history, but it was a gifted leader. It was their ability for relational skills and public ministry skills, and that would take you to 200. Not much about organizational, not much about strategic, but your primary, are you a fivefold gifted person, which I think always presupposes, whether it's teacher, pastor, apostle, prophet, evangelist, that presupposes that you're hardwired to be the lead in a church plant. So it's gift. Second, it's your relational skills. Can you engage people? Can you create a sense of a collective of people? And then third, your public ministry skills. If you have those tend to be the why, and that my observation agrees with that. I didn't come up with that grid, but 20 years of doing this with hundreds of churches, primarily larger churches now are my real expertise, but I could amen that. So we'll talk a little bit about public ministry skills, relational skills, and then fivefold, and the necessity of an assessment center. And also the necessity of, I hate to use this word, but consultants. It's really apostolic leaders that are well-trained at how to strengthen churches. That's really what it is. And I wish you South Africans that are great at names would come up with another word besides consulting, because I can't. But apostolic leadership always presupposes that you have the capacity to go back through and help strengthen churches that relate with you. Ronald, did I answer the question? Did I miss one of those questions? Because I want to make sure I answered all of them.
Yeah, you answered very well. I was asking about the natural barriers like floods, like COVID-19 that we experienced.
Yes. That's contextual. Yeah, that's contextual. So COVID was contextual. It was different in all nations. So they locked China down, but not where I live. We barely even wore masks where I live. Nothing shut down where I live. So the context of the way that nations handled that, and war and peace and persecution and famine and poverty and fire, all those things are contextual barriers.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Kevin.
You're welcome. And
Pastor Kevin.
Yes, go ahead.
I've got a question. Okay, go ahead.
Philip, it's Alexander on this side. Pastor Kevin, Alexander from Bloemfontein.
Yes.
Is it always a barrier, or is there sometimes just a cap to a leader's ability? So, for instance, a leader has a certain grace on his life, and that'll allow him to go to a certain amount of people, and he's not facing a barrier which he should break through. It's just a cap on his life. How do you think about those two?
Amen to you. We were going to cover that in the next session, but because you brought it up, we'll just go ahead and talk about it now. I think that's one of the most important things for anybody to understand. When you go into a church and strengthen the church, you remember I said you're not there to fix anything. We're not fixers. And so a close friend of mine was really, I didn't feel like they were called to be in the lead role of a church. And so I didn't think he needed to fix anything, because he was given a church and it was shrinking very fast. And it wasn't that he needed to be fixed. He needed to be repositioned. Now, the reason I wanted to pull back up that slide of the evangelical churches in the Philippines, we can take a look at this slide and make several assumptions. 19,000 churches are below 30. I think that's a definition issue, not a brokenness issue. God defines the size and scale of a church. God defines the gift of a church. I don't think anyone on this phone would want to eliminate those churches, those 19,000 churches. They're there for a kingdom reason. And giftedness is very, very much capped by Jesus himself. We'll talk about, I think there's some mystery. I don't think it's total science, but I don't think I could ever have done even close to what Steve Merle did. Not even close. I doubt that I could have done what some of the guys that are in their sites would have done. And so I do think you got to realize that sometimes that's where God actually has them. In fact, always God has them somewhere. I just want to help make them stronger. We're just trying to fix human things, not God's thing. God decides the size of church that a person has in them and what kind of a church he wants in that spot. He may want to reach 3 houses, and therefore you're 30 in your living room. That's exactly what he wants you to do. So yes, I couldn't agree with you absolutely more, all the way up the scale to the churches that run 800,000. God decides. That's God's decision. Now, if you've got sin in your life, I think you've just probably clouded what God wants to do in your life. If you don't want to skill your life up, you've probably clouded what God has wanted to do in life. If you don't want to do organizational, you've probably clouded that. And it's still a mystery. I think those things can be strengthened. And then whatever God wants to do, God will do. Fantastic question, Alexander.
Hi, Pastor Kevin. Mark here. Hope you're well. Pastor Kevin, my question is, if you feel like you're stuck in a barrier, how do you self-diagnose one of these, or do you need somebody external to help you? Not everybody might be able to get a consult in. So how do you kind of self-diagnose, which might not be possible?
Well, I would look at those 5 things. I think that is going to be covered more in the second session. These 2 are really almost inextricably bound together, because you have the what is it and then what must I do to change? Those are kind of almost immediately there. I think everybody on the phone probably has grown their church, shrunk their church, plateaued their church, and grown their church again. I know I did. And so I haven't relied a lot on we should always be self-diagnosed, much like we do on our body. You get a sore throat, you should self-diagnose your body. But at some point in time, when it's chronic, that's when you might need someone that has a set of skills that they can come and help you figure it out. One of my goals, I don't know when it started, probably 15 years ago, was on every continent, all over the world, free consulting and consultants that are actually skilled to do so and that are contextual, could be available to every church in every nation all over the world for this very reason. When Paul sent Titus to strengthen the churches in Macedonia, he had a deep connection to them and understood all those churches. He understood them. I love Ronald, but I don't understand Uganda. I don't understand what's going on in Kampala. I don't understand East Africa. So therefore, my grids are more global grids. That's the reason I have these global grids, because my passion is to help Mark and Stellenbosch. And really to help Mark and Stellenbosch, it takes a combination, in my opinion. It takes the leadership, it takes the church, and it takes a skilled person to come in and squeeze that leader and squeeze that church, because the church will tell you what's wrong, the leaders will tell you what's wrong, but you have to have a set of skills to get that. And that's what a consultant is. A consultant is not a genius. A consultant is a person that has honed a set of skills that can come in and squeeze the church, and the church itself will tell that consultant who has those skills to get that data out what is wrong. And it's never going to be a shock to any of the leaders. So Mark, my ultimate answer to your question is, if it's chronic, I would get help.
Right. Thank you.
And because I love to suffer, Jesus, don't call anyone in South Africa. The churches in Stellenbosch needs an American that's real old.
For a long weekend.
For a long weekend. That was a joke for all the rest of you.
Let's send in Jim Laffoon.
Yes. No, Laffoon will eat all your food and then leave.
Tenai, why don't you go, Tenai?
Sure, thanks. Hi, Pastor Kevin. So my question is, just looking at these stages and numbers of growth barriers, is there a way they can be avoided? And secondly, to that, how do we keep momentum? Because I'm just looking at our scenario, there's a number that we just kind of just moved past without hitting any barrier. But how do we then keep momentum to continue growing? Thank you.
That is a great question, and it's the second thing. So again, I knew you guys were going to do this. You were going to make me talk about the whole thing the whole time. So Philip, don't ever break it down like this again. It's just going to be a mess. So we're just going to do the messy. Yeah, I think that not every barrier every person will feel. I know a guy that actually planted a church and went to 800 people before he felt the barrier. I went to 300 with no stopping. We went 0 to 300. And then I hit that barrier like a train running into a concrete wall. And it nearly killed me. And so barriers aren't necessarily something that all of you will hit all the time. But I promise you, every one of you will hit a barrier without fail. It's inescapable. The greatest of all leaders come up against barriers. And then you have to have a diagnostic grid. Is this a spiritual problem? See, I thought every problem I had was spiritual back in the day. And when I hit the 300 barrier, I prayed more and I fasted more and I fasted more and I prayed more and I read my Bible more. And it took a charismatic Lutheran pastor that after I told him my heart-wrenching story of what was wrong with me in this church, he laughed and he said, "Oh, you just need to change the way you lead." And that was an epiphany to me. I thought it was all spiritual. So yes, that's why spiritual, personal, relational, organizational, missional, and contextual, those are so important to have as a grid, because it's broad enough where you can look at everything, but it's narrow enough to keep you focused on the true things that are there, and maybe give you categories to do analytics better. You'll notice if I ever come in and survey your church, you're going to have to give me data that will include almost every one of these pieces in it. And if one is not, I do research on my own to find out those things. So yes, you can hit barriers. You will all hit barriers. What do you do to maintain momentum? Well, we'll talk about that in the second session.
Let's give it just a question here from Yolanda Julius. And also welcome to all the school guys. Our school has just opened up and there's 14 students that is part of our school. And the Apostolic Passion was set up primarily as they started last night. So all the guys who have joined our Every Nation School in South Africa, welcome. Yolanda Julius just texted me because they're watching together. The question she's asking is, if the discipleship culture or the lack thereof impacts growth in the light of Corinthian scripture as we are human agents partnering with God. So how does the discipleship culture impact the growth barriers?
Yes, that's going to be under it has a dramatic impact on growth barriers. I built a church. When my church hit 550 to 600 in attendance, I hadn't raised a single leader. I reached a lot of people for Jesus. Engage was my single move. I had no idea how to do anything else, but I have passion to reach lost people. I was very effective at taking my mob and getting them to care about the lost and reach the lost. After that, I had no idea what to do with them. And so when I hit that barrier, it was impenetrable. And it was because I did not make disciples, period. And so absolutely everything depends on your capacity to create disciples, everything. And so So that's under both missional and organizational. Those will be the two categories that would house your 4 E's or whatever strategy, whatever missiological lens that you have. Those would be housed under those categories.